Forget everything you've seen in movies about Rome. When you think of gladiators, you picture slaves condemned to death. But that's a lie. In reality, a gladiator was not just a slave. He was a superstar with an income like a modern NBA player, the most desired sex symbol of the empire, and the most dangerous millionaire of the ancient world. Speaking of deadly risk, by the way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because it's possible we might not see each other again. And if the video is helpful, please hit the like button. It really helps the promotion. Here is the main paradox that Hollywood hid. How could a man who stood on the lowest rung of Roman society be simultaneously the most desired man, richer than most free citizens, and an idol whose name was written on walls? In this video, we'll leave the movie myths behind and dive into the most profitable, most brutal, and most paradoxical sport of the ancient world. We'll show how much they actually earned for one fight, what kinds of gladiators there were, and why free people voluntarily signed death contracts. Let's start with the man who set the whole thing up, the Lanista. He wasn't just an overseer, he was a risk investor. He bought slaves and poured huge amounts of money into their training, equipment, and medical care. His gladiators were living assets, and he protected them. The Lanista was the one who decided when you were ready to fight, and he was the one who could negotiate with the emperor over the rental price of his fighter. Gladiatorial games were incredibly expensive. They were sponsored by the editor, a politician who wanted to buy the love of the crowd, or an emperor who wanted to distract the populace from problems. The more fights, blood, and celebrities there were, the higher the editor's political clout. This was an arms race for public support. Gladiators were recruited from 4 sources. This was a complex labor market, and the first group was the most obvious: war captives and slaves. This, of course, was the foundation of the production. They were bought, and they started training virtually from scratch in specialized schools. But what about those who weren't bought, but simply condemned? Criminals. This category was sentenced to training, but only if they were physically valuable. Roman pragmatism came into play here. If you were a serious murderer, but also a powerful guy, you weren't killed right away. No, you were used as a state asset for several years, so you would first work off your execution in the arena. And finally, the most shocking and voluntary category: free volunteers, or octorati. These people, sometimes even women, voluntarily signed a contract, an octoramentum, that temporarily stripped them of their civil rights, making them legally dishonorable, infamous. But they took this incredible risk not out of coercion, but for fame, money, or to escape debt. Speaking of the infamous status, Emperor Commodus himself loved to enter the arena impersonating Hercules. This was political PR, but the Roman Senate was horrified because their ruler was voluntarily making himself infamous. This was a cultural shock for the elite. Let's talk about the most important thing, the money. To understand how insane this business was, we need to convert Roman sesterces into modern dollars that make sense to us and see what that money could buy. Let's start with the contract. When a free man signed his death contract, an octoramentum, he received around 2,000 sesterces. This was a signing bonus. What could he buy? Converted to modern purchasing power, that's roughly $10,000 to $12,000 today. You took that money, and in return, the Lanista gained complete control over your life. And how much did one performance cost? Initially, for each fight, a novice received the same 2,000 sesterces. What could you buy for that? Well, besides a whole slave. We calculated that in conversion, we're talking about the early empire, that's about 6,000 bottles of wine. But that was just the start of the career. A gladiator's contract was usually for a specific number of fights, usually 3 to 5. After that, if you survived and were famous, you could sign up again. And that's when the price skyrocketed. For each subsequent performance, they were already paying up to 12,000 sesterces. Let's convert this to our reality. So, 12,000 sesterces is already 36,000 bottles of wine. So not to get drunk, let's also count in bread, the main product. A novice could count on about 4,000 loaves for one fight, and a seasoned warrior, a star, received enough for 24,000 loaves. Now, when it comes to housing, things were a bit worse. We know very little, of course, but possibly the rent for housing in Rome was from 500 to 2,000 sesterces per year. We're talking about insulae, multi-story buildings where you could rent a room or apartment. That is, one successful fight could cover a year's rent. If we use the purchasing power method, 12,000 to 15,000 sesterces for one fight was equivalent to approximately 60,000 to 80,000 in modern dollars. For example, your neighbor, a Roman legionary, earned an annual salary, roughly $10,000 a year. A star gladiator earned an amount exceeding a soldier's annual salary in just one day. If he fought 3 to 4 times a year, his income could easily exceed $300,000 per year in modern equivalent. This was the deadliest but most profitable lottery in history, and that's why free people took this risk. A gladiator entering the arena was an expensive spectacle. The Lanista bore the costs for training, expensive armor, which was often rented, the best medicine and nutrition. That's why he was invested in your survival. You were his cash cow. The chance of dying in a fight? About 10 to 20% per bout. That's a high risk, but not a guaranteed death. Death sold fewer tickets than celebrity. If you fought beautifully, showed Roman virtue, and the crowd didn't show the thumbs down, you were pardoned. A beautiful loss was sometimes more important than an ugly victory. A gladiatorial school was not a prison, it was a military camp with elements of a hospital. The school was under constant guard to prevent escapes. Remember Spartacus? The discipline was brutal. The trainers were veterans who had been through it all. They knew every trick and every loophole. They taught not only how to strike, but also how to maintain formation and take a blow. The training was grueling. You worked for hours with heavy wooden swords against the post, palace, to build strength and endurance. The main thing was psychological resilience. You had to learn to ignore pain and look death in the face. Galen, one of Rome's greatest doctors, started his career right in a gladiatorial school. He described treating innumerable wounds. Archaeological finds confirm the highest level of medical care, complex surgeries, fracture repairs, suturing trident wounds. The gladiators' main food was a porridge of barley and beans called pulse. The high-calorie diet gave them a layer of fat under the skin. It wasn't for beauty, but for shock absorption. The fat served as protection for the muscles and internal organs from shallow cuts. Gladiatorial combat was not just a brawl, it was a thought-out game of chess where each fighter was part of a tactical puzzle created for maximum visual effect. Forget uniforms. The equipment was specially designed for tactical imbalance and maximum show. Let's start with the classic Roman style. This was the Murmillo, or the fishman. He was a heavy, classic fighter who relied on deep defense. You recognize him by the huge helmet with a wide crest, often stylized like a fish. He carried the heavy shield scutum, almost like a legionary, and fought with a short sword, the gladius. He was slow, but his blows were powerful. And his classic opponent was the barbarian fighter, the Thraex. This guy, named after Thrace, was the complete opposite. He was light, fast, and very offensive. He was distinguished by a helmet with a characteristic high crest, often adorned with a griffin's head, which made him visually more aggressive. Instead of a large shield, he had a small but thick shield, parmela, and his most important weapon was the curved sword Sika, designed to bypass the opponent's defense. The battle between the Murmillo and the Thrax was an arena classic, a battle of styles. But while those guys fought heavy, the next fighter was the biggest star of the show because he fought almost naked. This was the Retiarius, the man with the net. He fought without a helmet or shield, which maximally emphasized his speed and vulnerability. He wore only a loincloth and huge metal protection on his shoulder and left arm. His weapons were the famous net, rete, the trident, fuskina, and a short dagger. It was a battle of speed and agility against armor. the Empire specifically created an armored answer to the Retiarius. This was the Secutor, or the Pursuer. He was designed as the perfect counter to the Retiarius. His helmet was smooth and round with tiny, narrow eye holes, so the net couldn't snag and he couldn't be stabbed. The Secutor was heavily armored and armed with the Gladius. His goal was to quickly close the distance to the Retiarius and force close combat before the Retiarius suffocated in his sealed helmet. And let's finish this parade with the Greek style. This is the hoplomachus, the Greek spearman. His style imitated Greek hoplites. He was distinguished by a helmet with 2 large feathers and high greaves on both legs. He used a spear and a small round shield to control the space in the arena. You just saw this stunning, expensive equipment, but here is the main paradox and another way the Gladiator was controlled. The equipment was rented. The Gladiator did not own his armor. None of these expensive helmets or chainmail belonged to the fighter. All this luxurious gear was the property of the Lanista or the editor. The expensive helmets and chainmail were literally rented out for the show. This was another means of control. They gave you fame, but never complete ownership. If you lost and the crowd showed the thumbs down, by the way, they still argue about what that gesture meant, it was the end. Death was ritualistic. You had to accept the sword without crying and without fear, showing Roman virtue. This was the last thing you could sell to the crowd, a beautiful death. Your body was then taken care of by the mortuary worker, Retiarius, who dragged the body out of the Porta Libetiniensis, or in simple terms, the gate of death. Gladiators were sex symbols. Inscriptions on the walls of Pompeii read, Salatus, the Thraex, is the glory of the girls, and Crescens, the Retiarius, is the doctor of the night girls. They were the most desired men in the empire. Despite the infamous status, many had families, wives, and children. Their tombstones, dedicated by wives and children, speak of a fulfilling personal life outside the walls of the ludus. The main goal of any gladiator was the wooden sword, the Rudis. This was the symbol of retirement. You could retire, having become a veteran, open a business, or, as often happened, return to the school as a doctor, to train the new generation. This was the highest form of financial and personal freedom bought with blood. So that was the life of a Roman gladiator. High-paid, disciplined, risky, and incredibly public. They were a paradox, slaves who were richer and more famous than many free citizens. Their life was a mix of deadly risk and huge reward. And against this backdrop, it's logical to ask, if you were a free but poor citizen living in Rome, knowing that for one fight you could earn a 10-year salary, would you sign the Octoramentum and take that risk to become rich and famous, or would you choose security and poverty? What price would you pay for fame and financial freedom? Write what you think in the comments. And that's all for now. If you enjoyed this detailed breakdown of the lives of gladiators, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button so you don't miss the next video. See you soon!